Saints of the Americas is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church celebrated in the Americas. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Welcome to our show. We're going to talk about Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. It's interesting because Saint Kateri obviously is the only North American Indian to be canonized. She was born in New York, but then she died in Canada. And we're going to talk about what happened in between her birth and her death. Obviously, her death was at a young age, so we know that. So let's talk about her beginnings as an American Indian or a North American Indian, what that would have been like at that time.
Well, certainly we know that as it was for other cultures, to be a girl in that society was certainly a second-class citizen. So right there, she's at a bit of a disadvantage. But also, the sense of conversion among Native American Indians is not welcomed by the Indian population. Unlike other societies that might have just easily rejected it, you put your life at risk, and we'll see that later with Kateri. But it was a challenge for her. Her family experienced some difficulties. One of the reasons also why conversion was so frowned upon, it wasn't always just out of a religious sense, going against what the Native Americans, how they would have worshipped or what they would have done in their culture, but it was the exposure of illness, that they believed the quote-unquote white man, which oftentimes were the missionaries that were bringing this sense of conversion, it was the exposure to illness. And so with superstition and with all these other things that were going about, that would have been, it just created all kinds of difficulties. And we see that introduced into Kateri's family's life as well.
It's interesting because she died at the age of 24, but we know that her mother, who was an Algonquin Indian, herself was baptized. And so that faith that she had was really given to her and passed on to her by her mother. And it's something that she truly loved and truly cared for, because she decided to give her whole life to Christ. And she even pledged celibacy, virginity, and that was another thing that was really totally not allowed or permitted through her American Indian upbringing. So this is something.
And they would have felt that wasn't even her choice.
Exactly.
It certainly was not a young Kateri's choice whether or not she get married or not. This went against every societal norm there was. And again, going back to the illness too, we see that tragedy does enter her life. Both her parents and her brother die in a smallpox epidemic. And so there's a stigma attached to the family. There's this faith that is brought in by these people who've introduced this illness. She's decided to do something in their sense that's perverted, to not marry, to not procreate, to not have children. So there was a great sense of skepticism. I mean, her life and her desire to live that life centered on Christ challenged every notion that her people held.
We also see that there's this group of Jesuits who really protected her. And so they kind of take her under their wings because she's so vehement about practicing and living this faith and devoting herself and her virginity to Christ. And so they kind of take her under their wings, not only as a spiritual advisor, but also as someone who protects her, who moves her even geographically to different places where she could enjoy living and practicing her faith. But we know that this Lily of the Mohawk, who took on this role as a virgin, totally against her community, only lives to the age of 24. And so her young life that was really not spent in any length of years, yet there's a wealth of life and longevity in that short span because of what she experienced. And let's talk a little bit more about what she would have experienced internally, not having her family or her tribe around her, but being with strangers, but people of the same faith, and how that would have been more of a welcome to her than maybe her own people.
Well, in a sense, although they were Jesuit priests, and she's a Native American girl, we could say that she found a community, which is what religious communities become for individuals. They form this family. And so, as you said, she's certainly suffering the loss of her parents, her brother, the stigma and the loss of her community, because we can't make it so cut and dry. We can't say that because she loved God, it was so easy to just turn her back on her Native American community. That would have been an internal struggle and difficulty. But she did find that interior peace with these people who had the same faith, and who perhaps she found great comfort in the fact that they were looking at her and they found worth and value and dignity in her, that they approved of her decision to remain celibate, to not get married, to not have children, to give herself completely over to Christ in that way. But I think also part of why we recognize her as a saint, and although she's living in the 1600s, why she's a great example to young people today is she was able to go against all of those different cultures and all of those different, if we will, peer pressures of the day to remain firm in her love of Christ. And isn't that what we need for our young people today? To not give in to all of those societal norms that unfortunately have become accepted, and to stay more rooted in Christ.
I can't help but think of what an inspiration she would have been to those missionaries. Oftentimes we see missionaries as being people who inspire others, but they in turn need inspiration from those who become part of their flock. And obviously they would have found tremendous inspiration through her, not only because of her acceptance of the faith, but also because of her desire to stay steadfast and firm in that. And her allegiance to the Lord did not waver. And so I'm sure that was a tremendous sense of inspiration to those French Jesuits at the time who took her under their wing. We're going to talk about some other saints in a moment, but we're going to take a quick break, so please stay with us. We'll be right back.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. But she's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
The Society of St. Paul announces a new book called Saints of the USA by Brother Marco Buccarelli. This book, for children ages 6 and up, will fascinate young readers as they learn more about the saints of North America. Those who read it will meet 10 figures who have lived lives of holiness, as well as the Immaculate Conception of Mary, patroness of the United States. The book can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road on Route 224. The store is open Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com and learn more about these saints of our time. Welcome back to our show. We're going to talk about another Canadian saint, Blessed Marie Rose Durocher. It's interesting as we ended our talk about Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, who died in Canada. We talk about another Canadian saint, and we know that our final segment of today's show is going to be another Canadian saint. And this one was born in Quebec, Canada, but began her life in the lay apostolate. And we see how that working in parish life and in parish community and surroundings really drew her to a greater and even deeper calling. So let's talk a little bit about her early life.
Well, one thing that we know about her is she's from a large family, which many people of the time would have been. But she's the 10th of 11 children. So you can imagine within that household, there's more than one mother or father, as would be the case. So she would benefited from a lot of conversation, a lot of knowledge, a lot of interplay that perhaps was years above where she was, as often happens with the younger children. They grow up a little faster because they know more. It's interesting that even though she has spent 13 years, we're told, in this lay apostolate, it was in a parish community where her brother was the pastor. So we could say that there was still a greater understanding of religious background and perhaps even of a religious community, if you will, because their family, more or less, would have taken on the charism of a religious community. And so with her brother as the pastor, she becomes more and more involved in parish life and its various ministries. What that would have allowed her, as it does in parishes today, to discover your way. You can't be Mrs. Parish and do everything. Some people try, but you hone your skills and your gifts and your abilities. And for Rose, or Marie Rose, she finds her way, in particular, in education.
It's interesting because as you were talking, and you had mentioned that she is the 10th of 11 children, normally in those large families back then, vocations would have come from them. It would have been very normal to have large families produce one priest or two and one or two religious women. And so this was just part of their life and their culture, not only as Catholics, but as people of deep faith. And so we see this sense of family, as you had mentioned, working in the parish where she's a lay apostolate, her brother is the pastor, and no doubt there could have been other family members that were part of this parish life. And so that whole sense that as a family, they work together in this apostolate. And isn't that really the call of parish life? Many parishes call themselves the family of. And so there's that sense that we work as a family, but we're called to that greater family. Not a parochial family, but the greater, wider body of Christ. And how important is it for us to do that ministry with that in mind?
Absolutely. And unlike some of the other saints that we've been speaking about in this series, perhaps the difference between the Canadian saints, or people on the road to sainthood, and the Americans at the time we're talking, there was already a deep-rooted Catholic tradition. Because in Quebec, you're dealing with French Canadians, and France predominantly at that time, a Catholic country still, where the difference is predominantly English settlers in the United States would have brought their Protestant background. So when we're talking about saints, we have people of conversion, which are wonderful stories in and of themselves. But as you said, this would have been already a long-standing tradition and culture in this family. That Catholic faith would have been there for generations, and there could have been aunts, uncles, who were inspiring them as well, not only within this family or this generation of 12 children, but that could have been a long-standing tradition that exposed and formed and shaped how they were living their lives.
We know that Blessed Marie Rose began the order that she founded called the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary. And the whole purpose, and we talk at other times that the religious orders have a charism. And her charism, as you had mentioned, was religious education, but it was also to the poorest and the abandoned. And obviously, in the day and age where she would have been ministering, there probably would have been extremely poor people and people who would have been abandoned due to a disease or illness or whatever. And so her order also we see a growing, and there's a sense that her charism is taken on by other people who have this need and desire to educate religiously the people who are poor and abandoned. And we see, I'd like to read this opening prayer that's part of the Mass that's celebrated in her honor. And it says this: God enkindled the flame of ardent charity and a great desire to collaborate as teacher in the mission of the church. So she joins not only those who share faith, but the greater good, which is God who's encouraging all people to share that same faith.
Absolutely. And we see that one of the great ministries of the church is education, catechesis, faith formation. And so it certainly was an important and valued ministry at that time, and still is.
And I think we would be remiss if we did not talk about Catholic schools, and parochial schools. Those are institutions that are really fundamental to our institution as a Catholic Church, primarily here and especially here in the United States. That was something that the Church in the United States really found and fostered as something that was important, because these were institutions that helped continue and pass on and nurture the faith that was celebrated within families. In 1 minute of our time together, what would you like to say about Catholic education?
Well, as I mentioned, it still is a deep-rooted mission and ministry of the Church. We know that if we can just speak of our own place and time, certainly smaller families have had an impact on the size of our Catholic schools. The cost factor has certainly played a part, but it's worth noting that we still have very fine Catholic schools, and that it's still a very important ministry of the Church to educate our young people, not just in the subjects of the day, but in how all of that is translated in that community of trust and understanding and genuine care and concern for one another. We have wonderful public schools, we have good homeschool families, but in the Church we still lift up and exalt the choice of Catholic school education.
Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book on Louis and Zélie Martin, parents of St. Therese of the Child Jesus. The book focuses on her parents' journey towards sanctity in their family life and social commitments. This book was compiled for couple and group sharing and is meant to strengthen the journey of all in marriage and family life towards sanctity and holiness. The book can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road on Route 224, located across from the Olive Garden restaurant. The store is open Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com and learn more about these witnesses of our time.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy. Church World Service.
I am Marino. Je suis Marino.
I am Marino.
I believe that we are all connected to each other, and that is the gift of compassion that unites us and makes us one. It doesn't matter what language, culture, or tradition we come from. We can share compassion wherever we are.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Marino dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, and with your help, they can do more. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 Welcome back to our show. We're going to talk now about Saint Marguerite Duville. We know that she's the first Native Canadian to be elevated to sainthood, and she has a rich background. Let's talk about her beginnings. We know that she was born in 1701. She lived 70 years, but within that lifespan, she accomplished so much. And what were some of the hallmarks of her life that brought her to sainthood?
Well, and I think we mentioned in a previous segment the difference between American Catholics at this time and Canadian Catholics because of that long-standing Catholic tradition. We know that she's the oldest of 6 children, so a decent-sized family, not large by the standards of the day. We know that her father dies when she's only 7 years old, so the fact that she is the oldest of 6 and her father dies when she's 7, you know, there's all these young children that are left, and yet you could imagine that helps her grow up very fast because she would have been looked upon as someone who had to help, you know, the little mother who has to help. We know that the family is left then in great poverty. You know, we talk about during the time of Jesus, you know, that code of widows and orphans. It meant you didn't have an adult male in your house to provide for you. 17 centuries later, it's no different. You don't have an adult male, there's great poverty. But we know that she's influenced by her great-grandfather's life, you know, and that's what really gets her on her journey to even consider entering into religious life. And we know that initially starts with the Ursulines in Quebec. Now, we know a lot of our people will think of Ursuline High School and the Ursulines here, but that the Ursulines are a long-standing religious order, you know, that move beyond countries. And so we see that that's her first entree into religious life.
Let's take a few steps back and remind the folks that are with us that she marries Francois Duville, and they have 6 children, 4 of whom die. And so even in her own young married life, she's experiencing this tragedy, this poverty, this tremendous need. And then we see this tragedy getting even worse within her own married life. And how is it that these people find strength and the will to move on amidst all of these tragedies that befall them? And so we see that you know, her desire to help those who are needy really comes from her own circumstances, her own background, her own family life. And let's talk about her charitable works, because that is really what elevates her to sainthood. Where do those works find a home and a place?
Well, as you mentioned, it's almost like the pattern repeats itself. You know, she is a child who experiences the loss in family and the struggle and the poverty, raises herself out of that, is married. Again, that foundation. And I think we could go back to that foundation of, even though her education is interrupted with the Ursulines, that's where we see that beginning, that foundation. You know, that it was that first exposure to that religious community, even though she went and married, but then experiences the loss of children, experiences the whole breakup of that, what was to be this idyllic family situation. But isn't it true of anybody who suffered to try to still meet the needs of those who maybe you perceive are even less fortunate than yourselves, that in your own poverty you can recognize your blessings and to want to offer some sense of charitable living to others? And so I think it's the experience of when she was a child, it's the experience of her early married life and the loss of her own children. It's coupled with the gifts and blessings that were given to her, with the lack. She didn't have all the education she wanted. It gets interrupted because of how she has to help out in her own family situation. But all of that comes together to say, I have this calling to make someone else's life better.
You know, it's interesting as you were talking, what comes to mind is that these saints that we're talking about, these blessed, these servants of God, do not begin their ministry by saying, I'm going to start this religious order. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. They live their life and their ministry. They eat, breathe, and sleep this ministry. And then at some point, it evolves into creating a community because others join that cause. Others are attracted to that. And that's basically how these communities start. And so we know that she begins this, the Sisters of Charity of Montreal, because others have understood her desire and joined that desire to serve those. And we get this sense oftentimes that the saints are calculated, that they have this plan and that plan. It's not that way. No. It evolves. It's something that one understands the presence of God is there because it's God helping them and driving them, and they understand that they're doing this not because of any worldly desire, but some desire that's in them that wants to express this particular charism or truth.
It takes us back to that perhaps cliche, but it's so true. That necessity is the mother of invention. We see in the founding of religious communities or in the living one's charism in the church, as you said, it's not calculated. There's a necessity at the time. There's an individual or groups of people in need. And you bring those needs and couple them with your blessings or your gifts, skills, set, whatever it is. And that's where all of that grows out of. We can't believe for one moment the church would really bless calculation. Certainly you want to be wise in how you go about doing things, or otherwise it all falls apart. But I think it is that each of them had recognized a necessity to serve God in other people. And so it finds its way coupled with their gifts.
Another interesting thing is that they do this until the day they die. So it's not something that they do until they're 85. They do it until they take their last breath. And so we see Saint Marie Marguerite, that even in her old age, she builds these places. She invites more people into her charism and her community. And so that struggle continues in old age. And it's interesting because we know that Pope John the 23rd gave her a moniker. What name was that?
In beatifying her, he called her the Mother of Universal Charity. And I guess what's striking about that is, that we're talking about a pope who lived in Italy, who is able to reach back and look at the life of this woman in Quebec and recognize in her story. I think, again, for us, that kind of brings together that global community of saints, that we know their stories and we're influenced and affected by them, regardless of where they live, regardless of time or space or origin, that it's that universal church coming together, and that he could look to that story when there's so many others. And certainly there were probably other people who will be called that and are worthy of that title, but that in beatifying her, he gives her that title.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Saints of the Americas was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Korda and Father Jack Lavelle.